The transport shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere with the precision that marked all hegemony technology. Commander Zethkri watched through the viewport as the blue-green world grew larger, his four eyes taking in details that his tactical implants automatically catalogued. Population centers, energy signatures, defensive installations, all the standard intelligence gathering that had become second nature during his 3 decades of military service. Primitive, he muttered to his aide, Lieutenant Vextra, who stood at attention beside his command chair. Look at those cities. Sprawling, inefficient, completely vulnerable to orbital bombardment. The lieutenant nodded in agreement, her own implants recording every detail. The humans have been part of galactic society for only 12 of their years, Commander. Their technological advancement is still centuries behind our own. Zethkri leaned back in his chair, his scaled hide shifting against the adaptive material. The hegemony had been watching humanity for some time now, ever since their first stumbling steps into faster-than-light travel. They were an oddity among the galaxy's species, aggressive, chaotic, and surprisingly resilient for such a young civilization. But they were still just another member species, like the hundreds of others that had bent the knee to hegemony superiority over the millennia. This visit to the human military academy was little more than a formality, a diplomatic gesture to demonstrate the hegemony's continued interest in nurturing their newest members. Zethkri had been chosen for the honor precisely because of his distinguished service record. 17 worlds brought into the fold, countless battle victories, and a reputation for tactical brilliance that was known throughout the fleet. The humans would be suitably impressed by his presence. The shuttle's landing was smooth and efficient, touching down on the Academy's primary landing pad with barely a vibration. Through the viewports, Zethkri could see the welcoming committee assembled in neat military formation. Humans in their colorful dress uniforms, standing in perfect ranks despite their species' well-documented tendency toward individualism and disorder. At least they understand proper protocol, Vextra observed. Zethkri stood, his 7-foot frame imposing even among his own kind. His ceremonial armor gleamed with the decorations of his many victories, each medal telling the story of another world brought under hegemony control. Today would be simple, a tour of their facilities, some ceremonial exchanges of gifts, perhaps a demonstration of their quaint training methods. Then, he would file his report, noting their continued primitive status, and move on to more important matters. The shuttle's ramp lowered with a soft hiss, and Zethkri descended with measured steps, his aide and security detail falling in behind him. The human air was breathable, though somewhat thinner than he preferred, carrying strange scents that his enhanced senses catalogued automatically: plant life, industrial pollutants, and something else he couldn't quite identify. The human delegation approached with crisp military bearing. At their head walked a middle-aged male with graying hair and sharp blue eyes. His uniform bore insignia that Zethkri's implants identified as those of a general, though the exact rank structure of human military forces was still being studied by hegemony intelligence. Commander Zethkri, the human said, stopping at the precise distance required by diplomatic protocol and offering what their species called a salute. Welcome to the United Earth Defense Academy. I am General Marcus Harrison, commandant of this facility. Zethkri acknowledged the greeting with a slight nod, the gesture conveying just enough respect to avoid insult while maintaining his superior position. General Harrison. I am honored to visit your educational facility. The slight pause before educational facility was deliberate, a subtle reminder of the vast gulf between human military training and the sophisticated warfare doctrines of the hegemony. Harrison's expression didn't change, but Zethkri caught something in those blue eyes, a flicker of something that wasn't quite amusement, but wasn't deference either. We're honored to have you here, Commander, Harrison replied smoothly. We've prepared a comprehensive tour of our facilities. I think you'll find our methods interesting. As they walked toward the Academy's main buildings, Zethkri noted the construction with professional interest. The architecture was solid but unremarkable, clearly built for function rather than the artistic beauty that marked hegemony installations. Students, young humans in training uniforms, moved between buildings with purposeful strides, their movements displaying the discipline that was apparently universal among military organizations. Tell me about your student body, General, Zethkri said as they entered the main administrative complex. What sort of individuals does your species select for military service? Harrison gestured toward a large display showing graduation photos from recent classes. We draw from all segments of our population, Commander. Merit-based selection, regardless of social background, economic status, or planetary origin. Our colonies throughout human space send their best candidates here. Zethkri studied the faces in the photos with interest. Humans were remarkably diverse compared to most species, different skin colorations, facial features, and body types that spoke to their planet's varied environments. Most species achieved genetic uniformity early in their development, but humans seem to have maintained their diversity even as they spread to the stars. And what do you teach them? He asked. The fundamentals of military science, Harrison replied. Strategy, tactics, logistics, leadership, and specialized technical skills. But, more than that, we teach them to think. To adapt. To find solutions when conventional wisdom fails. Something in the general's tone caught Zethkri's attention. There was an undercurrent of pride there that seemed disproportionate to the accomplishments of such a young military organization. The humans had fought only a handful of minor conflicts since joining the galactic community, nothing that would require particularly sophisticated military thinking. They passed through corridors lined with displays showing human military history. Zethkri's implants translated the text automatically, revealing a surprisingly extensive record of warfare for a species so young. Conflicts that spanned millennia, fought with primitive weapons by modern standards but showing a complexity of strategy and determination that was unusual. Your species seems to have considerable experience with warfare, he observed, pausing before a display showing something called the Battle of Thermopylae. We have a long history of conflict, yes, Harrison acknowledged. It shaped who we are as a people. Our capacity for both destruction and protection, our understanding of sacrifice and victory. Zethkri read the details of the ancient battle, a small force of humans holding off a vastly superior enemy against impossible odds, fighting to the last man to protect their home. It was tactically foolish, a waste of resources that any competent commander would have avoided through strategic withdrawal. A noble defeat, he said, his tone carrying the dismissive note appropriate for such primitive heroics. Perhaps, Harrison replied quietly. Though I notice you read it as a defeat. The comment was strange enough that Zethkri glanced at the human general. Harrison's expression remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes again, that same unidentifiable quality that the commander couldn't quite categorize. They continued the tour, moving through classrooms where young humans studied star charts and tactical scenarios on holographic displays that were surprisingly advanced. The technology was still inferior to hegemony standards, but showed a level of innovation that spoke well of human adaptive capacity. In one classroom, they observed a lesson on fleet movement and coordination. The instructor, a woman with silver hair and sharp features, was demonstrating a complex maneuver involving multiple ship formations. The key, she was explaining to her students, is not to think of each ship as an individual unit, but as part of a living system. When one part is threatened, the whole organism responds. The enemy expects us to react according to doctrine, but doctrine is just a starting point. Real victory comes from understanding not just what your enemy can do, but what they think you can do. Zethkri listened with mild interest. The concepts were sound, if elementary. The hegemony had perfected such tactical thinking millennia ago. But, as the lesson continued, he found himself paying closer attention. The human instructor was presenting scenarios that seemed oddly specific, dealing with situations where a smaller force faced overwhelming odds. In this scenario, the instructor continued, highlighting a tactical display, you have 12 ships against a fleet of 80. Conventional wisdom says you retreat, preserve your forces, live to fight another day. But, what if retreat isn't an option? What if those 12 ships are all that stand between the enemy and something you cannot allow them to reach? The students leaned forward, engaged in the problem. One raised her hand. Hit and run tactics? Try to whittle them down over time? Good thinking, Cadet Morrison, but they have you outgunned and you can't maintain hit and run indefinitely. Anyone else? Another student spoke up. What about targeting their command structure? If we can create chaos in their ranks. Better. You're thinking asymmetrically. But, let's go deeper. What if I told you that this scenario isn't hypothetical? What if I told you that similar situations have occurred in our history, and that 12 ships, or sometimes fewer, have actually defeated superior forces? The students looked skeptical, as did Zethkri. Such outcomes were mathematically improbable unless the smaller force possessed significantly superior technology. The answer, the instructor said, lies in understanding what victory actually means, and in accepting possibilities that your enemy believes are impossible. She changed the display, showing a historical battle from human spacefaring history, something called the Defense of New Geneva. Zethkri's implants rapidly analyzed the tactical data, and what he saw made him straighten in surprise. A human colony fleet of 15 ships, mostly converted civilian vessels, had faced a pirate armada of nearly 60 military-grade raiders. According to the records, the humans had achieved complete victory with minimal losses. The tactical analysis showed maneuvers that were innovative, to put it mildly. How will one of the students asked, echoing Zethkri's own thoughts. The instructor smiled. They did something the pirates never expected. Instead of trying to match them in conventional battle, they turned their own weaknesses into weapons. The civilian ships couldn't win a straight fight, so they didn't try to. They used their cargo holds, their industrial equipment, even their life support systems as tactical assets. The pirates came expecting a standard raid against helpless targets. They found an enemy that redefined what the word weapon meant. Zethkri felt a slight chill that had nothing to do with the Academy's climate control. He was beginning to understand why the hegemony's initial assessments of human military capability might have been incomplete. After the classroom observation, Harrison led them to the Academy's simulation center. The facility was impressive even by hegemony standards, a massive chamber filled with holographic projectors that could recreate any battlefield environment with perfect fidelity. We use this for advanced tactical training, Harrison explained as they entered the control booth overlooking the simulation floor. Our final year students participate in complex scenarios designed to test their ability to think beyond conventional limitations. Below them, a group of human cadets was engaged in what appeared to be a space battle simulation. Their ships were outnumbered 3-1 by an enemy force that Zethkri recognized as using standard hegemony tactical doctrines. Interesting choice of opponent, he observed. Harrison glanced at him with that same unreadable expression. We believe in training against the best. The simulation played out in real time, with the cadets commanding their virtual fleet through direct neural interface. Zethkri watched with professional interest as the human force initially followed textbook defensive maneuvers, establishing a strong formation and preparing for the enemy assault. But, as the engagement developed, something changed. The humans began to break formation, their ships scattering in what appeared to be complete disorder. Zethkri's tactical implants screamed warnings about the foolishness of such dispersal against a coordinated enemy. They're making a fundamental error, he told Harrison. Breaking formation like that leaves them vulnerable to defeat in detail. Any competent commander would exploit that weakness immediately. Would they? Harrison asked quietly. On the simulation floor, the enemy fleet, following proper hegemony doctrine, moved to engage the scattered human ships with overwhelming force concentration. But, as they closed in, something unexpected happened. The scattered human ships weren't actually scattered at all. They were moving in a pattern so complex that it had appeared random to conventional analysis. As the enemy fleet committed to their attack runs, the human ships suddenly snapped into a new formation, not the defensive arrangement they had abandoned, but something entirely different. Something that used the enemy's own momentum and formation against them. The first enemy ships found themselves not pursuing scattered prey, but flying directly into carefully positioned crossfires. The human vessels had used their apparent retreat to create a trap so sophisticated that even Zethkri's enhanced tactical implants had failed to detect it until it was sprung. Within minutes, the superior enemy force was being systematically dismantled by tactics that seemed to violate everything Zethkri understood about proper fleet engagement. How? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harrison was watching the simulation with obvious pride. They learned to see the battlefield not as a static environment where strength meets strength, but as a dynamic system where chaos itself becomes a weapon. The enemy expected them to fight like the enemy would fight. Instead, they fought like humans. The simulation ended with complete human victory. The cadets emerged from their interface pods, laughing and congratulating each other with the easy camaraderie that seemed characteristic of their species. "Victory through unconventional thinking," Harrison said as they watched the students file out. "It's one of our core principles here." Zethkri said nothing, but his mind was racing. What he had just witnessed suggested that human military capability might be far more sophisticated than anyone in the hegemony had realized. These weren't primitive tactics, they were tactics so advanced that they appeared primitive to conventional analysis. As they left the simulation center, he found himself looking at the human academy with very different eyes. The unremarkable architecture suddenly seemed less like primitive construction and more like deliberate concealment. The casual bearing of the students seemed less like lack of discipline and more like confidence and abilities that others couldn't recognize. "General Harrison," he said carefully, "I'm curious about something. In the scenario we just observed, your students were facing an enemy using what appeared to be hegemony tactical doctrines." "Yes," Harrison confirmed. "May I ask why you chose that particular opponent for their training?" Harrison stopped walking and turned to face him directly. For the first time since their meeting, the human's expression was completely serious. "Because, Commander Zethkri," he said quietly, "we believe in being prepared for any possibility." The words were spoken with perfect diplomatic propriety, but Zethkri felt their weight like a physical blow. He was beginning to realize that this routine diplomatic visit might be revealing things that he would have preferred to remain hidden. And they were only 3 hours into the tour. The next phase of the tour took them to what Harrison called the practical training facilities. As they walked across the academy grounds, Zethkri noticed details that his earlier assessment had missed. The paths between buildings weren't randomly placed, they formed interlocking fields of fire, with seemingly decorative structures positioned to provide cover for defenders. The academy wasn't just a school, it was a fortress designed to look like a school. "Your grounds are quite beautiful," he observed, testing his growing suspicion. "Thank you," Harrison replied. "Our landscape architects believe that an environment should serve multiple purposes. Beauty and functionality don't have to be mutually exclusive." Lieutenant Vextra, who had been silent for most of the tour, leaned close to whisper in Zethkri's ear. "Sir, I'm detecting weapons emplacements disguised as art installations. At least 12 that I can identify." Zethkri kept his expression neutral, but his mind was cataloging every detail with new intensity. The humans weren't just hiding their capabilities, they were doing it so well that even his trained military eye had initially missed the obvious. They arrived at a large field where groups of cadets were engaged in what appeared to be physical training exercises. Zethkri had read about human sports, primitive competitive activities that served no clear military purpose. What he observed, however, looked like something else entirely. "Hand-to-hand combat training?" he asked, watching as pairs of students grappled with intense focus. "Among other things," Harrison confirmed. "We find that physical conditioning and combat skills remain relevant even in an age of advanced weaponry. You never know when you might find yourself without technological advantages." One of the instructors, a compact woman with scars that spoke of real combat experience, was demonstrating techniques to a group of attentive students. What caught Zethkri's attention was the sophistication of what she was teaching. These weren't the crude brawling techniques he might have expected from a primitive species. They were refined martial disciplines that seemed designed specifically for combat against larger, stronger opponents. "Interesting techniques," he commented. "They seem designed for fighting enemies with superior physical capabilities." The instructor overheard him and approached with a respectful nod. "Commander, I'm Sergeant Major Chen. The general told me you might be interested in our combat training programs." "Indeed I am," Zethkri replied. "Your methods appear quite sophisticated." Chen smiled, and there was something in her expression that reminded him of a predator showing its teeth. "We've had to be creative, sir. Humans aren't the biggest or strongest species in the galaxy. We've learned to compensate." "Perhaps you could demonstrate?" "I'd be honored," Chen said. She turned to her students. Who wants to volunteer to show the commander our basic defensive techniques? A young male cadet stepped forward eagerly. I'll do it, Sergeant Major. Excellent. Williams, you'll be playing the role of a hostile alien combatant. Larger, stronger, better armed. Chen, you'll demonstrate standard human defensive protocols. Sethkri watched with mild interest as the two humans prepared for their demonstration. The cadet playing the alien was indeed larger than the instructor, though both were still smaller than Sethkri himself. This should be a simple demonstration of basic defensive moves. What happened next changed everything. The engagement lasted perhaps 15 seconds. The cadet attacked with controlled aggression, using his size and strength advantages exactly as Sethkri would have expected. But Sergeant Major Chen moved like nothing the commander had ever seen before. She didn't try to match her opponent's strength or absorb his attacks. Instead, she used his own force against him, redirecting his momentum and turning his advantages into vulnerabilities. The demonstration ended with the larger cadet on the ground, Chen's training weapon pressed against his throat, having never actually stopped his attack, merely redirected it until it defeated itself. Fascinating, Sethkri said, and meant it. That's not simply combat technique, that's applied physics. Exactly, Chen confirmed. We call it adaptive engagement. The principle is that any force can be defeated if you understand how it moves and what it expects from you. And this works against significantly larger opponents? Chen's smile grew wider. Would you like to find out, sir? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sethkri found himself in an unusual position. As a hegemony commander, he possessed both genetic advantages and technological enhancements that made him significantly more capable than baseline humans. Refusing the demonstration would suggest fear, which was unthinkable. Accepting might reveal capabilities that he would prefer to keep hidden. I would be honored, he said finally. The training area cleared as word spread that the alien commander was going to spar with Sergeant Major Chen. Students gathered at a respectful distance, their expressions eager but controlled. Harrison watched from nearby, his face revealing nothing. Standard rules, Chen explained as they faced each other. Training weapons only, engagement ends at first decisive strike or submission. The goal is demonstration, not injury. Sethkri nodded, accepting the practice weapon. She offered a simple staff that his tactical implants immediately analyzed for weight, balance, and structural integrity. It was well made but unremarkable. What followed was the most disturbing combat experience of Sethkri's life. He began with standard hegemony combat protocols, using his superior reach, strength, and speed to establish dominance. His first attack should have ended the engagement immediately, precise strikes delivered with overwhelming force that would have incapacitated any normal opponent. But Chen wasn't there when his weapons arrived. She moved like flowing water, never where his tactical computers predicted she would be, never reacting the way his combat algorithms expected. More importantly, she wasn't just evading, she was learning. Each attack he made was met not with resistance but with redirection. His own strength was being used to carry him past his intended targets, his momentum exploited to create openings that shouldn't have existed. Worse, she was adapting to his patterns faster than he was adapting to hers. Interesting technique, she said conversationally as they circled each other, neither having landed a decisive blow. Hegemony military training emphasizes overwhelming force application, doesn't it? Sethkri said nothing, focusing on his tactical analysis. His implants were screaming warnings about her unpredictable movement patterns, but they couldn't provide solutions. Every strategy they suggested was based on opponents who fought according to recognizable doctrine. The problem with overwhelming force, Chen continued, easily avoiding his next attack combination, is that it only works if your opponent tries to match force with force. She flowed inside his guard with impossible speed, not to attack but to demonstrate that she could have. Then, she was gone again, leaving him striking at empty air while his own momentum carried him off balance. What if they don't? She asked. The end came suddenly. Sethkri committed to a devastating overhead strike that should have shattered any defense. Instead of blocking or evading, Chen moved forward, inside the arc of his weapon, using his own attack to provide the momentum for her counter. Her training staff touched his throat with barely perceptible force. Complete defeat. In less than 2 minutes. Against an opponent half his size with no technological enhancements. The silence that followed was broken by polite applause from the watching students. Chen stepped back and offered a respectful bow. "Thank you for the demonstration, Commander. That was most educational." Zethkri stared at her, his tactical implants still trying to process what had just happened. "How?" he asked. "Practice," she replied simply. "And philosophy. We learned long ago that in a galaxy full of beings stronger, faster, and better armed than we are, matching them strength for strength is suicide. So we learned to fight differently." "Differently how?" Chen glanced at Harrison, who nodded slightly. "We learned to make their strength irrelevant. To fight not against what they are, but against what they think we are. And we learned that the most dangerous opponent is not the one who's stronger than you, it's the one who's willing to redefine what victory means." As they walked away from the training field, Zethkri found himself deeply unsettled. Everything he had observed suggested that human military doctrine was not primitive at all, it was revolutionary. They had developed approaches to warfare that were so fundamentally different from established norms that they would be almost impossible to counter using conventional strategies. "General," he said carefully, "may I ask how widely these techniques are taught?" "They're part of our basic curriculum," Harrison replied. "Every human military academy teaches similar programs. It's considered essential knowledge for anyone who might face superior opponents." "And how do you define superior opponents?" Harrison stopped walking and looked at him directly. "Anyone who assumes that military superiority is determined by conventional measurements of strength, technology, or numbers." The implications were staggering. If these techniques were standard throughout human military training, then every assessment the hegemony had made about human capabilities was dangerously incomplete. They had been measuring human strength by hegemony standards, completely missing the possibility that humans might not be trying to match those standards at all. Their next stop was the Academy's research and development facility. Here, Zethkri expected to find the kind of primitive experimentation typical of young civilizations, crude attempts to improve existing technologies without real understanding of underlying principles. Instead, he found something that made his blood run cold. The R&D facility was underground, accessed through security checkpoints that were far more sophisticated than anything he had seen on the surface. The technology scanners that examined them were subtle but thorough, and his enhanced senses detected power readings that suggested serious defensive capabilities. "We conduct some classified research here," Harrison explained as they descended. "Nothing that violates any galactic treaties, of course, but we prefer to keep certain projects secure until they're ready for broader application." The laboratories themselves were impressive, clean, well-equipped, and buzzing with the kind of focused energy that spoke of important work being conducted. What caught Zethkri's attention, however, were the projects themselves. In one lab, researchers were working with something that looked like conventional energy weapons, but his tactical implants couldn't properly analyze their power signatures. The weapons seemed to exist in a quantum superposition, simultaneously powerful and harmless until the moment of firing, at which point they became whatever was most effective against their specific target. "Adaptive weaponry," the lab director explained when Harrison introduced him. "Dr. Kim has been working on systems that modify their operational parameters in real time based on target analysis." Dr. Kim, a young woman with intense eyes and hands stained with chemical residues, looked up from her work. "The principle is fairly straightforward," she said. "Instead of building a weapon optimized for a specific threat, we build weapons that optimize themselves for whatever threat they encounter." "Fascinating," Zethkri said, though his tone didn't convey the growing alarm he felt. "And this works against unknown threat types?" "Especially against unknown threat types," Dr. Kim confirmed. "The more unfamiliar the target, the more effectively the system adapts. It learns from what doesn't work and modifies its approach until it finds something that does." They moved to another laboratory where a different team was working on something even more disturbing. The project appeared to involve strategic analysis software, but not of any type that Zethkri recognized. Predictive tactical modeling, the researcher explained. We feed the system data about an enemy's military doctrine, command structure, technological capabilities, and cultural values. Then, it generates scenarios for how that enemy would likely respond to various strategic situations. Zethkri studied the displays with growing unease. The system was currently running simulations against what was clearly hegemony military doctrine. The accuracy of the models was terrifying. They had somehow acquired detailed knowledge of hegemony strategic thinking and were using it to develop countermeasures. How did you acquire the data for these models? He asked. The researcher glanced at Harrison, who nodded. Observation, mostly. Analysis of publicly available information about how various species approach military problems. Cultural studies. Economic patterns. It's amazing how much you can learn about someone's military thinking by understanding how they organize their society. And these models predict behavior accurately? Very accurately, the researcher confirmed. In fact, they've been so successful that we've started using them to predict our own behavior. It's quite humbling to realize how predictable you are when someone understands your underlying assumptions. The final laboratory they visited was the most disturbing of all. Here, researchers were working on something that defied immediate categorization. It appeared to be a combination of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and something else that Zethkri's implants couldn't identify. Strategic synthesis, Harrison explained. This system takes all of our various research projects and integrates them into comprehensive tactical packages. It doesn't just predict how an enemy will behave, it designs entire campaigns for defeating enemies we haven't even encountered yet. It designs campaigns against hypothetical opponents? Against every possible opponent, Harrison corrected. The system generates tactical solutions for threats that exist, threats that might exist, and threats that we hope will never exist. It's constantly running scenarios, refining strategies, preparing for contingencies that we haven't even imagined. Zethkri studied the displays showing the system's output. There were tactical packages for defeating energy-based lifeforms, strategies for fighting in dimensions with different physical laws, and campaign plans for wars fought entirely in quantum space. But what made his hands tremble was the section labeled Hegemony Scenarios. You've developed specific strategies for fighting the hegemony, he asked, his voice carefully controlled. Harrison's expression didn't change. We've developed specific strategies for fighting everyone, Commander. It's not personal, it's simply good planning. After all, as you mentioned earlier, the galaxy is a dangerous place. One never knows what threats might emerge. As they left the research facility, Zethkri's mind was reeling. What he had seen suggested that humanity possessed not just unconventional military capabilities, but a systematic approach to warfare that was centuries ahead of anything in the known galaxy. They weren't trying to match existing powers, they were preparing to defeat all existing powers. General, he said as they walked back toward the Academy's main buildings, I'm beginning to understand that human military doctrine is far more sophisticated than our initial assessments suggested. Is it? Harrison asked mildly. I suppose that depends on how one defines sophistication. We simply try to be thorough in our preparations. Thorough enough to defeat any possible enemy? Harrison stopped walking and looked at him with those sharp blue eyes. Thorough enough to survive, Commander. In a galaxy where might makes right, survival requires being prepared for anything. Even the unthinkable. The words were spoken quietly, but Zethkri heard the steel beneath them. This wasn't boasting or posturing. It was a simple statement of fact from a species that had looked at the galactic order and decided that they would not be its victims. For the first time in his distinguished career, Commander Zethkri began to understand what fear meant. The afternoon brought what Harrison described as a cultural exchange session, an opportunity for Zethkri to address the Academy's students about galactic military history and share perspectives on the broader strategic environment. What was presented as a simple lecture, however, became something far more revealing and disturbing. The Academy's main auditorium could seat over 1,000 students, and it was packed. Young humans in crisp uniforms filled every seat, their attention focused on the stage where Zethkri stood beside a holographic display showing the galactic map. Their faces showed the kind of respectful attention that any lecturer would appreciate, but there was something else in their eyes and intensity that suggested they were not merely listening, but analyzing. "Before we begin," Harrison said as he introduced the session, "I thought it might be valuable to provide some context about human military history. Commander Zethkri has expressed interest in understanding how our species approaches warfare, and I believe our students would benefit from seeing that history from an outside perspective." Zethkri nodded politely, but noticed that several large display screens around the auditorium were showing what appeared to be a timeline of human conflicts. His implants automatically began translating and analyzing the data, and what he saw made him uncomfortably aware that he was about to discuss military history with a species whose relationship with warfare was far more extensive than he had realized. "Humans," Harrison continued, "have been fighting wars for approximately 10,000 years of recorded history. During that time, we've developed certain perspectives on military conflict that may differ from those of other species. Commander Zethkri, perhaps you could begin by sharing how the hegemony approaches strategic planning?" It was a straightforward request, the kind of general overview that Zethkri had delivered countless times to various audiences. He began with standard doctrine, the importance of technological superiority, the value of overwhelming force, the necessity of maintaining clear command structures and following established protocols. As he spoke, he noticed that the students were taking notes, but not in the way he expected. Instead of simply recording his words, they seemed to be analyzing his statements, cross-referencing them with information on their personal displays, and exchanging glances that suggested active evaluation of what they were hearing. "An interesting approach," one student said when Zethkri paused for questions. "The emphasis on technological superiority makes sense for a species that has maintained galactic dominance for millennia. But what happens when that technological advantage is negated?" The question was asked with perfect politeness, but Zethkri felt its edge. "Technological advantage is rarely completely negated," he replied. "Superior technology, properly applied, tends to create cascading advantages across all aspects of military operations. But, hypothetically," another student pressed, "if an opponent developed countermeasures that rendered your technological advantages meaningless, how would hegemony doctrine adapt?" Zethkri paused, considering his response. The question revealed an uncomfortable assumption that hegemony technological supremacy could somehow be overcome. "Such a scenario is unlikely," he said finally. "The hegemony's technological development programs ensure that we maintain decisive advantages across all relevant military technologies." A third student raised her hand. "Sir, in your experience, have you ever encountered opponents who used strategies that your tactical computers couldn't predict?" The question hit uncomfortably close to his recent experience with Sergeant Major Chen. "Tactical computers are tools for analysis," he said carefully. "They enhance decision-making but don't replace strategic thinking." Of course, the student agreed. "But have you encountered opponents whose strategic thinking was based on assumptions so different from your own that your computers couldn't model their behavior?" Zethkri found himself in the unusual position of being questioned by students who seemed to know more about tactical theory than many of his own officers. "Could you provide an example of what you mean?" The student gestured to one of the display screens, which now showed a battle map from human history. "The Battle of Kenny, sir. A smaller force completely destroyed a much larger enemy army by using tactics that the enemy couldn't understand until it was too late. The losing side had superior equipment, better training, and numerical advantage. They lost because they couldn't imagine that anyone would fight the way their enemies actually fought." Zethkri studied the tactical display with interest. The battle showed a classical encirclement maneuver, though executed with unusual sophistication. "An interesting historical example," he said. "Though I note that such tactics work only once against any given opponent." "Do they?" another student asked. "That same commander used similar approaches in multiple battles against the same enemy. The enemy kept losing because they couldn't adapt their thinking fast enough. And, more importantly," a third student added, "they kept assuming that their enemy would eventually start fighting properly according to their own understanding of how warfare should work." The questions were becoming uncomfortable for reasons that Zethkri couldn't quite articulate. The students weren't challenging his knowledge, they were questioning the assumptions underlying everything he thought he knew about military strategy. Harrison stepped forward. Perhaps it would be helpful to show Commander Zethkri some of our own historical examples. Students, could you walk us through the siege of Bastogne? The main display changed to show a detailed tactical map of what appeared to be an ancient human battle. A small force was completely surrounded by a much larger enemy army, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, facing certain defeat. Standard military doctrine would call for immediate surrender, one student began. The defending force was outnumbered 4-1, had no supply lines, and faced enemy forces with superior equipment and air support. But they didn't surrender, another student continued. When the enemy commander demanded surrender, the human commander replied with a single word, nuts. They chose to fight. The interesting part, a third student added, isn't that they chose to fight against impossible odds. It's how they fought. They didn't try to break out or establish conventional defensive positions. Instead, they turned their entire situation into a weapon. Zethkri studied the tactical display as the students explained the battle. The surrounded humans had used their desperate situation to draw enemy forces into extended urban combat, where superior numbers and equipment became liabilities rather than advantages. They had turned their own encirclement into a trap for their enemies. The enemy expected them to either surrender or attempt a conventional breakout, the first student concluded. They never considered that the humans might use being surrounded as a tactical advantage. And this worked? Zethkri asked. Complete victory, Harrison confirmed. The surrounded force held until reinforcements arrived, and the enemy army was eventually routed. The battle became a symbol of human military philosophy. Which is? Zethkri asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. That there's no such thing as an impossible situation, Harrison said quietly. Only situations that require impossible solutions. The next historical example was even more disturbing. The students presented a space battle from humanity's early expansion period, a single human colony ship facing a pirate fleet of 12 vessels. The colony ship had no weapons, a student explained. It was a civilian vessel carrying 10,000 colonists to their new home. The pirate fleet was military grade, designed for exactly this kind of prey. What happened? Zethkri asked, though his tactical implants were already analyzing the scenario and finding no feasible solutions. The colony ship won, another student said simply. Complete victory. All 12 pirate ships destroyed. How? The students exchanged glances before answering. They used their colonists as weapons. The explanation that followed challenged everything Zethkri thought he knew about space warfare. The colony ship had jettisoned thousands of cryopods containing sleeping colonists, creating a debris field that the pirates had to navigate carefully to avoid civilian casualties. But the pods weren't random debris, they were precisely positioned to create gravitational anomalies that pulled the pirate ships into specific approach vectors. As the pirates maneuvered through the field, trying to minimize civilian casualties while positioning for attack, the colony ship had systematically destroyed them using improvised weapons created from industrial equipment, life support systems, and even the ship's own artificial gravity generators. They turned their helplessness into the pirates' greatest vulnerability, one student explained. The pirates couldn't attack effectively without risking massive civilian casualties, but, by trying to minimize those casualties, they exposed themselves to weapons they never saw coming. The colonists were willing participants? Zethkri asked, appalled by the implications. They voted on it, Harrison said. 10,000 civilians, facing certain death or slavery, chose to risk their lives as part of a desperate gamble. They turned themselves into tactical assets. And this is considered acceptable human military doctrine? It's considered effective human survival doctrine, Harrison corrected. When facing extinction, conventional ethics become a luxury you can't afford. The final historical example was the most chilling of all. It showed the first contact between humans and a hostile alien species, the Vectar, aggressive raiders who had destroyed several human colonies before encountering organized resistance. The Vectar were technologically superior in every measurable way, a student began. better ships, better weapons, better defensive systems. They had conquered dozens of species across this part of the galaxy. Human military forces couldn't match them in conventional warfare, another student continued. Every direct engagement resulted in human defeat. Standard doctrine would have called for negotiated surrender or strategic withdrawal. But humans chose a different approach, a third student said. They studied the Vectar's conquest patterns and realized something important: the raiders always followed the same basic strategy. They would demand surrender, and, if refused, they would demonstrate their power by destroying a symbolic target. Usually, this convinced their enemies to submit. So humans gave them what they expected, Harrison said. When the Vectar fleet arrived at Earth and demanded surrender, human representatives agreed to negotiate. They invited the alien commanders to a surface meeting to discuss terms. And then? Zethkri asked, though his combat instincts were already warning him that this story would not end conventionally. The meeting was real, Harrison explained. Human negotiators genuinely attempted to reach a peaceful settlement. But they also prepared for the possibility that peace might not be achievable. The tactical display showed the meeting location, a small island on Earth's surface where human and alien representatives had gathered. It appeared to be a straightforward diplomatic conference. The negotiations lasted for 6 hours, a student continued. During that time, the humans made increasingly desperate offers: technological data, resource rights, even partial planetary occupation. The Vectar representatives became convinced that humanity was a broken species, ready to surrender everything to avoid destruction. They weren't entirely wrong, another student added. Humanity was desperate. Earth's defenses couldn't stop a full Vectar assault. Surrender might have been the rational choice. But humans had prepared one final option, Harrison said quietly. If the negotiations failed, if the Vectar proved unwilling to accept anything short of total domination, humanity was ready to demonstrate why Earth was a poor choice for conquest. The display changed to show a cross-section of the island where the meeting was taking place. Beneath the conference facility, Zethkri could see something that made his blood run cold: a massive nuclear device, powerful enough to sterilize the entire region. When the Vectar representatives finally rejected all human offers and moved to finalize humanity's surrender, a student explained, the human negotiators made a counteroffer. They would detonate the device, killing everyone present, human and alien alike, unless the Vectar fleet immediately withdrew from human space. They were willing to commit suicide to deny the enemy victory? Zethkri asked. They were willing to commit suicide to ensure that conquering humanity would be too costly for anyone to attempt, Harrison corrected. The message wasn't just for the Vectar, it was for every species in the galaxy. Attack Earth, and even victory would destroy everything you hoped to gain. And the Vectar response? Complete withdrawal, a student said. They recognized that a species willing to destroy itself rather than submit was too dangerous to fight. The cost of victory would always be higher than the value of conquest. More importantly, Harrison added, word spread throughout this part of the galaxy. Other aggressive species began to reconsider whether human space was worth the risk. Humanity gained a reputation as a species too dangerous to attack, even when defenseless. Zethkri sat in silence for several long moments, processing what he had heard. The students watched him with polite attention, but he could see something else in their eyes: evaluation. They were studying his reaction to their history, measuring his response to the revelation of what humanity was really capable of. These examples, he said finally, suggest that human military doctrine is based primarily on asymmetric warfare and psychological deterrence. It's based on survival, Harrison said simply. Everything else is just tactics. But such approaches only work against opponents who are unwilling to accept unlimited casualties, Zethkri observed. What if you faced an enemy that valued victory more than any price you could extract? The question was intended to identify a weakness in human strategic thinking. Instead, it produced a silence that was more unsettling than any answer could have been. Commander, one of the students said finally, what makes you think we haven't? Before Zethkri could respond, another student continued the thought. Our history includes wars against enemies who were willing to accept any sacrifice for victory. We learned to make victory impossible to achieve, regardless of what price they were willing to pay. How? He asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. By redefining what victory meant, Harrison said quietly. By making sure that achieving their objectives would be functionally equivalent to total defeat. The lecture session ended shortly afterward, but Zethkri found himself deeply disturbed by what he had learned. Human military history wasn't just a record of clever tactics and desperate gambles, it was a systematic exploration of how to make warfare itself unwinnable for any aggressor. As the students filed out of the auditorium, many of them stopped to shake his hand and thank him for his presentation. Their manner was perfectly respectful, but Zethkri couldn't shake the feeling that they had learned more about him than he had about them. And that, he was beginning to realize, might have been the entire point of the exercise. Evening brought what Harrison termed informal discussions, an opportunity for Zethkri to speak privately with faculty members and senior students about broader strategic questions facing the galaxy. The setting was deliberately casual, a faculty lounge overlooking the academy's grounds, with comfortable seating and refreshments designed to encourage open dialogue. Zethkri had agreed to the session hoping to gain deeper insights into human strategic thinking without the formal constraints of the day's presentations. What he discovered was that the humans had been hoping for exactly the same thing about him. "Commander," said Dr. Sarah Chen, the Academy's head of strategic studies and someone who bore a striking resemblance to the combat instructor from earlier, "we've been fascinated by your perspectives on galactic security. From the hegemony's viewpoint, what would you say are the greatest threats to long-term stability?" It was a reasonable question, the kind that Zethkri had answered in countless briefings and policy discussions. "Resource competition remains the primary destabilizing factor," he began. "As younger civilizations expand their territorial requirements, conflicts over habitable systems become inevitable. The hegemony's role is to mediate these disputes and ensure that expanding populations don't threaten established order." "Interesting," Dr. Chen replied. "So you see expansion pressure as the core problem. But what about technological disruption? New discoveries that change the fundamental balance of power?" Zethkri considered the question carefully. "Technological advancement is generally positive for galactic stability, provided it occurs within established frameworks. The hegemony's research oversight protocols ensure that dangerous innovations are properly controlled and gradually integrated into existing systems." Several faculty members exchanged glances at this statement. Dr. Patricia Okafor, the Academy's chief of technical studies, leaned forward slightly. "That assumes that all significant technological development occurs within hegemony oversight. But what about independent research by member species? Surely some innovations emerge outside official channels?" "Independent research is permitted within certain parameters," Zethkri acknowledged. "Member species are free to pursue technological advancement that doesn't threaten galactic security or violate established protocols." "And who determines what constitutes a threat to galactic security?" asked Commander James Rodriguez, a faculty member whose military bearing suggested extensive field experience. "The Hegemony Council evaluates all technologies with potential military applications," Zethkri replied. "This ensures that destabilizing capabilities don't emerge without proper oversight." "Even theoretical research?" Dr. Chen asked. "Pure science with no immediate applications?" "All research has potential applications," Zethkri said firmly. "Responsible governance requires considering long-term implications, not just immediate uses." The conversation continued in this pattern for several minutes, polite questions that seemed to probe the boundaries of hegemony oversight and control. Zethkri found himself explaining policies and procedures that he had never really examined critically. The humans' questions weren't challenging the legitimacy of hegemony authority directly, but they were exploring its practical limitations with uncomfortable precision. "Let me pose a hypothetical scenario," said Dr. Michael Torres, the Academy's senior war historian. "Suppose a member species developed a defensive technology that made them effectively immune to conventional military action. Not a weapon, mind you, purely defensive. Would the hegemony consider that a threat to stability?" The question was clearly theoretical, but it touched on fundamental principles of galactic governance. Any technology that significantly alters the military balance requires careful evaluation, Zethkri replied. Even defensive innovations can be destabilizing if they undermine established security arrangements. So immunity from attack would be considered destabilizing? Dr. Torres pressed. Even if the species in question had no aggressive intentions? Intentions can change, Zethkri said. A species that cannot be held accountable for its actions might eventually choose to act without regard for galactic stability. But, what if their defensive capabilities specifically prevented them from projecting power beyond their own territory? Commander Rodriguez asked. What if the technology only worked within their home systems? Zethkri paused, realizing that the conversation had moved from theoretical discussion to something that felt like a tactical briefing. Any capability that removes a species from normal diplomatic channels is potentially problematic. Mutual vulnerability is the foundation of galactic peace. Ah, Dr. Chen said softly. So the ability to defend oneself is inherently aggressive? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Zethkri felt that he was being led somewhere, but couldn't identify exactly where or how. Excessive defensive capability can encourage reckless behavior, he said carefully. Like what? Dr. Okafor asked. Refusal to negotiate. Rejection of legitimate hegemony authority. Actions that would normally be prevented by fear of consequences. I see, Dr. Torres said. So fear of consequences is essential for maintaining order. Fear of consequences is essential for maintaining civilization, Zethkri corrected. Without consequences, there can be no law. Without law, there can be no peace. The faculty members nodded as if this confirmed something they had been discussing among themselves. Dr. Chen made a note on her personal display before speaking again. That's a fascinating perspective, Commander. Tell me, in your experience, how does the hegemony typically respond to species that develop capabilities you can't counter? The question was asked casually, but Zethkri felt its weight. Such situations are rare. Hegemony technological superiority is comprehensive across all relevant fields. But, hypothetically, Dr. Torres pressed, if such a situation arose, what would be the standard response? Zethkri found himself in an uncomfortable position. The honest answer to the question was classified information that he couldn't share with representatives of a member species. But, evasion would be obvious to these clearly intelligent individuals. The hegemony would seek to understand the new capability and develop appropriate countermeasures, he said finally. And, if countermeasures proved impossible? Commander Rodriguez asked. Then, integration protocols would be developed to ensure that the new capabilities served galactic stability rather than threatening it. Integration protocols, Dr. Chen repeated slowly. Could you elaborate on what that might involve? Zethkri realized too late that he had revealed more than he intended. Integration protocols were euphemistic terms for forced technological sharing, typically accomplished through economic pressure, political isolation, or in extreme cases, military action. Such measures would be developed on a case-by-case basis, he said evasively. Of course, Dr. Okafor said. But, generally speaking, would these protocols focus on gaining access to the technology, neutralizing it, or something else? The conversation had clearly moved beyond academic discussion, though Zethkri couldn't determine exactly what kind of information the humans were actually seeking. Their questions suggested knowledge of hegemony procedures that should not be available to member species. Dr. Chen, he said, changing direction, you seem remarkably well informed about hegemony strategic doctrine. May I ask where you acquired such detailed knowledge? Academic research, primarily, she replied smoothly. We find it important to understand the broader strategic environment in which humanity operates. Knowledge of how galactic governance actually functions helps us make better decisions about our own development. And, what conclusions has your research produced? The faculty members exchanged glances again before Dr. Chen answered. We've concluded that the galaxy is a more complex place than it initially appeared. Power relationships that seem stable may be more fragile than they appear. And, survival in such an environment requires understanding not just official policies, but the realities behind those policies. Realities such as? Such as the fact that membership in galactic civilization comes with certain constraints that aren't always explicitly stated in the treaties, Commander Rodriguez said quietly. Zethkri felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. What sort of constraints? Limitations on technological development, Dr. Torres said. Restrictions on military capability. Requirements to share strategic resources. Obligations to accept hegemony oversight of activities that are theoretically sovereign. These are standard provisions for maintaining galactic stability, Zethkri replied automatically. Oh, we understand that, Dr. Chen said. The question is whether all member species understand it with equal clarity. For example, when humanity joined galactic civilization, were we fully informed about the extent of these constraints? The question was a trap, and Zethkri recognized it too late to avoid it. The honest answer was that new member species were typically given information about their obligations gradually, as they demonstrated readiness to accept fuller integration into galactic society. Immediate disclosure of all requirements tended to provoke resistance that could destabilize the integration process. Information sharing follows established protocols designed to ensure successful integration, he said. Which means that some information is withheld until later, Dr. Okafor observed. Which means that integration is managed to minimize cultural shock and political resistance, Zethkri corrected. I see, Dr. Chen said. And if a species objects to obligations that weren't initially disclosed? Objections can be addressed through proper diplomatic channels. And if diplomatic channels prove inadequate? Zethkri said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. The faculty members nodded as if he had confirmed something they already knew. Commander, Dr. Torres said gently, we appreciate your candor. These conversations have been extremely educational. Educational how? Zethkri asked, though he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. They've helped us understand the true nature of humanity's position in galactic society, Commander Rodriguez replied. We've learned that our membership comes with obligations that extend far beyond what we initially agreed to. We've learned that our technological development is subject to oversight that we didn't know existed. And we've learned that resistance to these arrangements is discouraged through methods that are remarkably effective. More importantly, Dr. Chen added, we've learned that the hegemony views any significant independent capability as a potential threat to galactic stability. Which suggests that our continued development as a species depends entirely on remaining weak enough to be manageable. The implications of what she was saying struck Zethkri like a physical blow. The humans hadn't just been studying hegemony strategic doctrine, they had been analyzing it as a system of control that they were subject to. Worse, they had apparently concluded that their only alternatives were submission or confrontation. Dr. Chen, he said carefully, I hope you understand that humanity benefits enormously from membership in galactic civilization. The protection, trade opportunities, and technological access that membership provides far outweigh any administrative requirements. Oh, we understand the benefits, she replied. We also understand the costs. The question we've been grappling with is whether those costs are fixed or negotiable. What do you mean? We mean that if humanity's continued existence depends on remaining strategically irrelevant, then we need to understand what happens if we choose not to remain strategically irrelevant, Dr. Torres explained. Zethkri stared at them in growing alarm. Are you suggesting that humanity is considering resistance to legitimate hegemony authority? We're suggesting that humanity is considering all of our options, Commander Rodriguez said quietly. Including options that might not have been available to previous species facing similar situations. Such as? The faculty members were silent for a long moment. Finally, Dr. Chen spoke. Commander, what would you say if I told you that everything you've seen here today, the academy, the students, the research facilities, even this conversation, represents only a small fraction of humanity's actual capabilities? I would say that such claims would require substantial evidence, Zethkri replied, though his voice was steadier than his thoughts. Evidence such as? Dr. Okafor asked. Demonstrated capabilities that exceed current assessments of human technological and military development. Interesting, Dr. Chen said. And what if I told you that we've been demonstrating exactly those capabilities all day, but that your analytical frameworks are designed to categorize them as primitive rather than advanced? Zethkri felt the blood drain from his face as the implications hit him. Every assessment his implants had made, every tactical analysis his systems had provided, had been based on assumptions about what constituted advanced capability. If those assumptions were wrong, if humans had developed technologies and strategies that appeared primitive to conventional analysis precisely because they were so advanced, then everything he thought he knew about human capabilities was dangerously incomplete. That would suggest, he said slowly, that humanity has been deliberately concealing its true developmental status. Not concealing, Dr. Torres corrected. Simply developing along paths that don't register as threats to conventional analysis. After all, as you pointed out earlier, the hegemony monitors all research with military applications. So any species seeking to develop genuine defensive capabilities would need to pursue approaches that don't appear to have military applications. Approaches such as what? The faculty members exchanged one final set of glances before Dr. Chen answered. Such as redefining what military capability means, Commander. Such as developing technologies that appear to be failures by conventional standards but are actually solutions to problems that conventional thinking can't recognize. Such as building a civilization that looks primitive and chaotic from the outside but is actually the most sophisticated defensive system ever created. She paused, watching his face carefully before continuing. Such as ensuring that any attempt to treat humanity as a manageable threat will discover that humanity is not manageable, not a threat in any conventional sense, and not anything that the galaxy has encountered before. The room fell silent. Zethkri sat motionless, his tactical implants screaming warnings as they attempted to process possibilities that they had no frameworks for analyzing. He was beginning to understand that his visit to this human academy had revealed far more than he had ever intended to learn. And that the implications of what he had learned would change everything. The final hours of Zethkri's visit began with what should have been a routine farewell ceremony. Instead, they became the most terrifying experience of his long military career. General Harrison had invited him to a private meeting in his office before departure, ostensibly to discuss future cooperation between the hegemony and human military institutions. Zethkri entered the simply decorated room expecting diplomatic pleasantries and ceremonial gift exchanges. What he found was a wall covered with star charts, tactical displays, and what appeared to be comprehensive intelligence files on every major military power in the galaxy. "Please, sit," Harrison said, gesturing to a comfortable chair facing his desk. "Can I offer you refreshment? I know the day has been long." Zethkri accepted the offered beverage, a human stimulant called coffee that he had found surprisingly palatable, while his eyes continued to catalog the displays around the room. His tactical implants were working overtime, trying to process the sheer volume of strategic information that was apparently casually displayed in an academy administrator's office. "Impressive collection of data," he observed carefully. "Knowledge is the foundation of effective defense," Harrison replied. "We've found it important to understand the broader strategic environment as thoroughly as possible." "And this level of detail is typical for human military education?" Harrison's expression became serious. "Commander, I think it's time we had a completely honest conversation." The words carried a weight that made Zethkri's combat instincts activate. He found himself automatically cataloging exits, assessing potential threats, and preparing for possibilities that his conscious mind hadn't yet articulated. "I'm not sure I understand," he said. "I think you do," Harrison replied quietly. "You've spent the day observing human military capabilities, educational methods, and strategic thinking. You've seen things that don't match previous hegemony assessments of our species. You've asked questions that suggest you're beginning to understand that those assessments might be dangerously incomplete." Zethkri said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. Harrison stood and walked to the star chart covering one wall of his office. "Let me show you something that will clarify our situation." The display activated, showing a three-dimensional map of local galactic space. Hegemony territory was marked in blue, human space in green, and various other member species in different colors. It appeared to be a standard strategic overview of the region. This is how galactic civilization currently sees local space, Harrison said. The hegemony controls approximately 60% of inhabited systems, with various member species occupying smaller territories under hegemony protection. Humans control roughly 3% of local space, making us a minor member with limited strategic significance. An accurate assessment, Zethkri agreed. Now let me show you what that map actually represents, Harrison said. The display changed, and Zethkri felt his blood turn to ice. The new image showed the same territorial boundaries, but with additional information that revealed connections he had never suspected. Human space wasn't three isolated systems, it was the central hub of a network that extended throughout the entire region. Every human colony established since we joined galactic civilization has been positioned according to a comprehensive strategic plan, Harrison explained calmly. Not for resource extraction or population growth, but for maximum strategic coverage of galactic civilization's most critical infrastructure. The display highlighted shipping lanes, communication networks, and resource distribution systems. Human settlements weren't randomly placed colonies, they were strategic positions that gave them influence over virtually every aspect of galactic commerce and communication. This is impossible, Zethkri whispered. Hegemony oversight would have prevented such positioning. Hegemony oversight approved every single colony site, Harrison confirmed. Because every application was submitted with perfectly legitimate justifications. Resource surveys, population pressure, trade opportunities, all completely accurate and properly documented. We simply didn't mention the strategic implications. You deceived the council. We provided complete and accurate information, Harrison corrected. We simply let the council reach their own conclusions about our motivations. Their assumptions about human goals and capabilities led them to approve positioning that they would have rejected if they had understood its actual significance. Zethkri studied the display with growing horror. If the information was accurate, humans had essentially surrounded galactic civilization's core infrastructure while appearing to be nothing more than enthusiastic new members establishing minor colonies. But, even with strategic positioning, your military forces are insufficient to threaten hegemony control, he said. Your fleets are tiny compared to ours. Harrison smiled, and Zethkri recognized the expression he had been seeing all day, the look of someone who knew something important that their opponent didn't. Commander, what would you say if I told you that we don't need fleets to threaten hegemony control? I would say that space warfare requires spacecraft. Does it? Harrison asked. What if the real targets of space warfare aren't enemy fleets, but the economic and communication systems that enemy fleets depend on? The display changed again, showing the same network of human positions with additional details that made Zethkri's tactical implants scream warnings. Every human colony site was positioned to control critical infrastructure choke points. More importantly, each site was apparently equipped with capabilities that could disrupt galactic commerce and communication on a scale that would paralyze civilization itself. You're positioned to shut down galactic civilization, Zethkri said in disbelief. We're positioned to defend ourselves, Harrison corrected. But, yes, our defensive capabilities would have significant side effects for anyone who chose to attack us. This is blackmail. This is deterrence, Harrison said firmly. We studied galactic history, Commander. We learned what happened to species that remained militarily weak in a civilization dominated by stronger powers. We decided that we wouldn't allow that to happen to humanity. So you built a weapon aimed at galactic civilization itself. We built a civilization that couldn't be safely attacked, Harrison corrected. There's a difference. Zethkri's mind was racing, trying to process the implications of what he was seeing. If Harrison was telling the truth, humans had spent their first decade in galactic civilization building not just defenses, but a doomsday device disguised as peaceful expansion. The hegemony will never accept this, he said. The hegemony will accept this, Harrison replied, because the alternative is the collapse of galactic civilization. We're not threatening to conquer anyone, Commander. We're simply ensuring that conquering us is impossible. And, if the hegemony decides that your elimination is worth the cost? Harrison's expression became grim. Then, they'll discover that we anticipated that possibility as well. The display changed one final time, showing something that made Zethkri's hands begin to shake. The network of human positions wasn't just designed to disrupt galactic infrastructure, it was designed to be completely autonomous. If humanity was attacked and defeated, the network would continue operating according to predetermined protocols that would systematically dismantle galactic civilization over a period of decades. "You built it to operate without you," he breathed. "We built it to ensure that our destruction would be meaningless," Harrison confirmed. "If humanity ceases to exist, galactic civilization ceases to exist. If we prosper, everyone prospers. It's a simple equation." "This is insane." "This is survival," Harrison said quietly. "Commander, you spent the day asking questions about human military capabilities and strategic thinking. Now you know. We don't fight wars, we make wars unwinnable. We don't defeat enemies, we make attacking us equivalent to suicide. We don't conquer civilizations, we make ourselves impossible to conquer." Zethkri sat in stunned silence, trying to process what he had learned. Everything he had observed during his visit suddenly made terrible sense. The unconventional training methods, the asymmetric tactics, the research into adaptive technologies, all of it was part of a comprehensive approach to warfare that was so far beyond anything in hegemony experience that they hadn't even recognized it as military development. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked finally. "Because you're going to report back to the Hegemony Council about what you observed here," Harrison said. "And we want to make sure you give them an accurate picture of humanity's current status." "You want me to reveal your capabilities?" "We want you to prevent a war that would destroy galactic civilization," Harrison corrected. "Because if the hegemony attempts to treat humanity as a threat to be eliminated or controlled, they'll discover that we're neither. We're something entirely new, a species that has evolved beyond the possibility of conquest." Harrison returned to his desk and activated a small device. The displays around the room changed to show real-time status information from across human space. Thousands of installations, millions of personnel, and systems so sophisticated that Zethkri's implants couldn't even categorize them properly. "This is what humanity has become during our 12 years in galactic civilization," Harrison said. "Not a member species hoping for protection from stronger powers, but a civilization that has redefined what strength means." "We're not threatening anyone, Commander. We're simply ensuring our own survival. But if anyone chooses to test our defenses, they'll discover that survival and deterrence can be the same thing." "The Council will never believe this," Zethkri said. "Then, they'll send investigators to verify your report," Harrison replied. "We'll show them the same things we've shown you. They'll reach the same conclusions."